In the winter of 1316, a traveller walking through a small village in northern England would have noticed a terrifying silence. No dogs barked, no livestock lowed. Even the birds seemed to have fled the sky. But if you looked closer at the mud-caked hovels, you would find the reason. The dogs had been boiled. The horses had been butchered. And in the dark corners of those huts, humans were looking at each other with a hunger that defied God himself. Most history books tell you about the glory of knights and the majesty of kings. They lie by omission. The real history of the Middle Ages wasn't written in gold. It was written in mud, blood, and the desperate chewing of tree bark. We are taught that humans are civilized. But 3 years of relentless rain proved that civilization is nothing more than a thin crust of bread. When that bread vanished during the Great Famine, the people of Europe didn't honor just starve. They transformed. They ate their work animals. They ate their pets. They ground toxic roots and stones into flour to stop the screaming in their stomachs. And then, according to the bone-chilling chronicles of the time, they crossed a line from which there is no return. Today, we are diving into the menu of the desperate. We are exploring the gut-wrenching reality of what it was actually like to be a medieval serf when the earth stopped producing. This isn't just a story of hunger. It's a journey into the absolute limit of human survival, a time when the only thing left on the table was the unthinkable. Welcome to the darkest chapter of human history. To understand the depths of the Great Famine, we must first understand what normal looked like for the medieval peasant. For a serf, life was a cycle of backbreaking labour fueled by a diet that was as monotonous as it was essential. At the centre of this world was a single, blackened iron pot hanging over a central hearth. Inside that pot was pottage, the foundational dish of the Middle Ages. Pottage wasn't a specific recipe, it was a strategy. It was a thick, slow-boiled porridge made of whatever could be gathered. On all good day it was a hearty of oats or barley, flavoured with pot herbs like leeks, onions, and cabbage grown in the small garden plot behind a peasant's hut. If the family was fortunate, a bit of bacon fat or a scrap of salted pork might be tossed in for flavour, but for the most part, this was a plant-based existence. It was heavy in fibre and carbohydrates, designed to provide the thousands of calories needed to plough fields from dawn until dusk. Then there was the bread. While the nobility dined on manchet, fine, bolted white wheat bread, the serf ate maslin. This was a dark, dense loaf made from a mixture of rye and wheat, often containing the chaff and sweepings of the mill. It was hard enough to break a tooth and often served as a trencher, a literal edible plate that soaked up the juices of the pottage. To wash a tea down there was water. Medieval water sources were often stagnant and contaminated by livestock. Instead, everyone, from toddlers to the elderly, drank small beer. This was a low-alcohol, unfiltered ale that provided a vital source of vitamin B and extra calories. It was safer than water because the boiling process during brewing killed most pathogens, making it the literal liquid bread of the masses. In a successful year, this diet was enough. It was humble and schnell. A serf might even enjoy a feast day where the village shared a communal ox or drank fermented cider. But this entire system was incredibly fragile. It relied on a precise balance of sun and rain, and a social contract that demanded the serf give a massive portion of their harvest to the local lord and the church. The peasant was living on the razor's edge of calorie neutrality. They produced much, but kept only enough to survive until the next harvest. There was no safety net, no global trade, and no surplus. When the rains of 1315 refused to stop, the pottage began to thin and the liquid bread stopped flowing. The foundation of medieval life was about to crumble, and the search for calories was about to turn into a descent into horror. The struggle for food wasn't just a battle against nature. It was a battle against a rigid legal system that prioritized the sport and wealth of the elite over the survival of the poor. As the fields turned to mud, a starving serf might look toward the lush, green forests or the teeming rivers nearby and see a solution. But in the Middle Ages, the land didn't belong to the people, it belonged to the crown and the lords. This was the era of the forest laws, a set of draconian rules that turned the act of survival into a capital crime. To the medieval mind, the forest was a royal larder. A peasant caught hunting a deer wasn't just a thief. They were a poacher committing a crime against the king's venison and vert. The punishment for killing a royal stag could be as brutal as blinding or the loss of hands. Even the smaller creatures, rabbits, pheasants, and partridges, were off limits. If a father was caught setting a snare to feed his starving children, he faced public shaming, heavy fines he couldn't afford, or imprisonment in a dungeon that was effectively a death sentence. Even the very trees were guarded. In times of desperation, wood was vital for heat and for crafting tools. But greenwood, living trees, could not be cut. Serfs were restricted to by hook or by crook, meaning they could only take dead what they could reach with a shepherd's crook or a billhook. When the rains made the ground too cold for crops, the inability to gather enough fuel to cook or dry out a damp hut became a slow, freezing execution. The oppression extended to the very technology of food. Every serf was legally bound to the lord's mill. You were forbidden from owning a hand mill to grind your own grain at home. You had to bring your meagre portion of rye to the official manorial mill, where the miller, often a man hated by the village, would take a multure, a significant cut of the flour, as a tax. If the miller suspected you were grinding grain in secret to avoid this tax, the lord's men would raid your cottage and smash your grinding stones. This was the grand squeeze of the feudal system. The church demanded its tithe, 10% of everything you produced, and the lord demanded his labour and his taxes. By the time a peasant actually sat down to eat, a massive portion of their hard work had already been siphoned away by the elite. When the Great Famine hit, this system did not bend. The lords continued to demand their dues, and the church continued to preach that suffering was God's will. The serf was trapped between a sky that wouldn't stop crying and a social order that wouldn't stop taking. As the hunger deepened, the laws of the land began to matter less than the laws of the stomach. And the forest, once a forbidden garden, became a site of desperate, illegal scavenges. The year 1315 didn't just bring a bad season. It brought the end of the world as the medieval peasant knew it. It began with the rain. In the spring of that year, the heavens opened and simply stayed open. This wasn't the gentle irrigation needed for crops. It was a biblical, relentless deluge that lasted for months. Across northern Europe, from the shores of Ireland to the plains of Poland, the soil became a saturated, suffocating grave for seeds. The wheat and barley, the lifelines of the population, rotted in the earth before they could even sprout. This was the beginning of the Great Famine, a catastrophe triggered by what historians now call the Little Ice Age, the medieval warm period, which had allowed the population to boom for centuries, was over. The temperature dropped and the growing season shrank. By the autumn of 1315, there was no harvest. The hay, needed to feed livestock through the winter, could not be dried and turned into mouldy sludge. By 1316, the desperation reached a fever pitch. The price of bread didn't just rise. It skyrocketed, increasing by over 300% in some regions. Salt, the most vital preservative of the age, became a luxury that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. Without salt, meat could not be cured, and fish could not be stored. The entire infrastructure of food preservation collapsed. Then came the murrain, a series of devastating diseases that swept through the animal population. A mysterious respiratory plague decimated the sheep, while a form of rinderpest wiped out the cattle. For a medieval serf, losing an ox was like a modern farmer losing a tractor and a bank account at the same time. Without oxen to pull the heavy ploughs through the waterlogged clay, the few fields that might have been salvageable remained unplanted. Men and women began to drop dead in the streets of the great cities and in the muddy tracks of the villages. The death toll was staggering. In many areas, 10 to 15% of the population perished in just a few years. Funerals became so common that the traditional rites of the church were abandoned. Bodies were simply tossed into mass pits. The social fabric was tearing. People began to realise that the church's prayers weren't stopping the rain. And the king's laws weren't filling the belly. The survivors were no longer looking for a meal. They were looking for a way to stay alive one more hour. And the moral boundaries that had held society together for a millennium were about to be tested in ways that haunt history books to this day. As the traditional food supply evaporated, the human body's primal urge to survive triggered a terrifying transition. The medieval serf moved from eating food to consuming matter, when the grain was gone and the last of the salted meat had been consumed. The peasants turned to the only things left, the animals that shared their homes and the very earth beneath their feet. First, the working animals were sacrificed. Horses, which were vital for transport, and dogs, which were essential for guarding the home, were slaughtered. In the early months of 1316, the sight of a dog in a village became a rarity. They had all been boiled into thin, flavourless broths. When the pets were gone, the rodents followed. Rats and mice, usually seen as pests that stole grain, became a sought-after source of protein. Contemporary accounts describe people hunting for vermin, with a fervour usually reserved for royal stags. But even the animals weren't enough to sustain a continent. Cissis wenn's a menu of desperation turned trésor. Peasants began to look to the trees. They discovered that the inner layer of bark from certain trees, specifically birch and pine, could be stripped away. This cambium layer was bitter and woody, but it contained enough starches to be dried and ground into a desperate excuse for flour. This bark bread offered no real nutrition and was incredibly difficult to digest, but it provided the physical sensation of fullness. A temporary relief from the agonizing cramps of an empty stomach, the desperation didn't stop at the forest. People began to gather acorns and roots that were normally considered poisonous or inedible, boiling them for hours to leach out the toxins. In the most extreme cases, the starving turned to the ground itself. There are harrowing reports of people mixing clay and soil into their meagre portions of flour to stretch the volume of their loaves. This dirt bread gave the illusion of a heavy meal, but it led to horrific intestinal blockages, killing many who thought they had found a way to survive. Perhaps the most stomach-turning reality was the scavenging of the waste. In the streets of towns like London and Paris, starving peasants were seen sifting through piles of animal dung, desperately searching for undigested grains of corn or barley that had passed through the systems of the few remaining horses owned by the wealthy. Every scrap of organic matter was potential fuel. The dignity of the human spirit was being stripped away, layer by layer, as the hunger transformed the peasantry into a population of ghosts, wandering the landscape in search of anything, literally anything, that could be swallowed. The line between what was food and what was waste had vanished. And the final, most sacred line of human taboo was now the only one left to cross. The year is 1317, and the darkness has reached its peak. At this stage of the Great Famine, the psychological and moral collapse of Europe was complete. When every animal has been eaten, when the bark is stripped from the trees, and when the dirt bread no longer sustains life, the human brain enters a state of primal desperation where the most ancient taboo, the consumption of one's own kind, begins to whisper in the ears of the dying. While historians once debated whether accounts of medieval cannibalism were merely exaggerated metaphors for suffering, modern analysis of contemporary chronicles suggests a much grimmer reality. In the British Isles, the Irish and English annals began to record horrific scenes. There are reports of prisoners in jails being torn apart and eaten by their fellow inmates, too weak to resist. In the countryside, travellers were warned to stay off the roads, as those who wandered alone were disappearing, not two bandits looking for gold, but two hunters looking for meat. In Poland and Silesia, the records are even more explicit. Chroniclers describe the flesh of the dead being sold in hidden markets. There is a chilling account of a mother who, driven mad by the sight of her skeletal children, was discovered consuming the remains of her own infant. This is the origin of the darkest elements of European folklore. When we look at the story of Hansel and Gretel, children abandoned in the woods by parents who can no longer feed them, only to find a witch who wants to eat them, we are not looking at a fantasy. We are looking at a cultural trauma born from the Great Famine. It was a collective memory of a time when the hearth was no longer a place of warmth, but a place of terror. The Church, which had spent centuries preaching about the sanctity of the body and the resurrection of the flesh, was powerless. They could offer no theological comfort to a man who had watched his neighbours dig up fresh graves in the churchyard to find sustenance. These weren't isolated incidents of madmen. These were the actions of a desperate biological species pushed to the absolute edge of extinction. The social contract was utterly incinerated. The trust between neighbour and neighbour, parent and child, and subject and king vanished. If the king could not provide bread, and the church could not provide a miracle, then the only law left was the law of the more. This period proved that civilization is only 3 missed meals away from chaos. And for the medieval serf, those meals had been missing for years. The human body had become a commodity, a final, terrible resource in a world that had run out of everything else. The Great Famine didn't just kill people. It killed the very idea of what it meant to be human. By 1322, the rains finally ceased, and the harvests slowly returned to their golden hue. But the Europe that emerged from the Great Famine was a scarred and haunted landscape. The survivors were no longer the same people who had stood in the fields in 1314. The trauma of the menu of desperation had left a permanent mark on the collective soul of the peasantry. And the physical consequences would resonate for decades to come, biologically. The generation that survived the famine was stunted. Children who had grown up eating bark bread and watered-down pottage reached adulthood with weakened bones and compromised immune systems. This was not just a personal tragedy. It was a demographic ticking time bomb. Modern researchers believe that the extreme malnutrition of the Great Famine left the European population uniquely vulnerable. When the Yersinia pestis bacteria, the Black Death, arrived only 25 years later, it found a continent of people whose bodies had never truly recovered from the hunger. The famine had cleared the path for the plague. Socially, the foundations of feudalism were beginning to crack. The serfs had seen their lords hide behind stone walls with stockpiled grain while the villagers starved. They had seen the church fail to intercede with the divine. The old excuse for the class system, that the nobles fought for all and the clergy prayed for all, felt like a hollow lie when the peasants were the ones forced to eat soil to survive. This resentment sowed the seeds for the great peasant revolts of the late 14th century. The hunger had taught the common man a dangerous lesson. The natural order was fragile, and survival didn't depend on a crown, but on the land itself. The legacy of this dark era lives on in our language and our stories. When we speak of a bitter harvest or scraping the bottom of the barrel, we are using idioms born from a time of literal life and death. The dark fairy tales we tell our children are the echoes of mothers and fathers who had to make impossible choices in the mud of 1316. We look back at the medieval serf and see a figure of pity. But we should also see a figure of incredible, terrifying resilience. They endured a world where the sky turned against them, and their neighbours became threats. They ate the roots, they stripped the trees, and they stared into the abyss of the ultimate taboo. They survived the impossible so that history could continue. The story of the medieval diet isn't just a list of ingredients. It's a testament to the lengths the human spirit will go to keep the flame of life flickering, even when the only thing on the menu is despair. 1151.